The only thing that exists is spectacles, things that seemingly serve as platforms to eventually delineate an issue into its, I guess, most primal form until you can realize what the truth is going to be about that thing. But it often feels like nobody actually is ever going to do anything about that particular form within that spectacle outside of just extracting what they can, materialistically speaking, from the spectacle itself. Yeah, it's really the reason why it's very hard for me to like just take both socialists and Republicans serious. I can't take like overly political people serious. Sometimes I have a hard time taking my own videos serious. I've been reading a lot of schizoanalysis, right? When I made that video about schizoanalysis or a schizoanalytic critique of the Oedipus complex from Deleuze's and Guattari's perspective, I wasn't saying that I'm schizophrenic, right? Some people reached out and they was worried that I was losing my mind, but trust me, my mind has been lost. It just wasn't specifically lost to that cause. It's not a matter of like me, just yapping to sound deep. This is really like a thought that became popular during the 70s and 80s and ultimately inspired relics of information that we know to be true from movies like The Matrix, right? Where you can literally see simulacra and simulation in that scene with Neo when he's in his apartment. And I think little things like that is cool to pay attention to in the world because you'll see a lot of relative associations with things that are uh, historical political ideas. I guess world historical ideas that you don't really think about because it's in the background of like your existence. I think schizoanalysis is just about the idea that you have a body, you have the mind or Oedipus itself, right? If you are a psychoanalytic type of person. If you go to therapy, Oedipus. If you are more so on the spiritual side, that things don't necessarily relate to just mommy and daddy, I will just use the term mental for you. So mental is just an abstraction from the body, and then another abstraction on top of the mental, right, can be, let's say, the social, society. This is the world, or at least a platform that a lot of different relics of control can exist upon. And we call those relics of control on top of this abstraction ideology, which is another abstraction that purely exists to control those relics of the social, if that makes sense. And then on top of that, of course, is the world historical viewpoint, background that is built out throughout history because the perfect synthesis of force is just played out among those ideologies. And once you look at the world from that perspective, I guess this is my main point, it's very hard to see that what we deem to be worthy of the type of life that most people want is even something that is worth powering from an energy perspective, quite literally, right? So, for example, I want to apply this to AI technology, right? I'm starting to realize that Moloch actually exists. And for those who aren't familiar with Moloch or Baalel, Moloch, Baalel, they're different names for gods that existed within the ancient Israelite times within the Levant region. And this particular god was seen as an agriculture god, the god of prosperity in regards to like land. So a lot of people sacrifice their children, they sacrifice neighboring tribes to this god in order to reap the benefits of this prosperity for their agricultural lands, because this is within that period where we are now starting to be domesticated by the plants we grow. It's not the other way around. Some people think it's the other way around, but pretty much our way of living before the Industrial Revolution happened, you will see clearly that we went from being hunters and gatherers to being malnutritious because all we're eating is like grain all the time. that's a separate conversation for a separate video. But my point is that once this becomes your material way of life, certain circumstances will generate themselves. Baalel exists, Moloch exists in today's world, and we essentially worship things that are deteriorating society from a humanitarian perspective, right? If you look at things happening in Sudan right now, there's one of the biggest humanitarian crises in the world happening there, outside of just what the mainstream media portrays with the Israeli and Gaza conflict. I'm not saying that that's not an important issue. I'm just saying that there's a lot more things happening in the world that a lot of people don't care about because they're not given mainstream light. The news tends to create worthy victims and unworthy victims. And I think the things that are considered to be worthy outside of just victims or subjects that are subjugated to a certain social body, outside of those things can be things like culture, can be things like expectations that people have for themselves that is essentially injected into by a desiring flow. How is it possible that somebody's mind operates on this level? And why can't my mind operate on this level? Because it's not the fact that I'm stupid. It's the fact that like every day is the same for me. So it's really hard trying to see past it, right? It's like when people be like, how come black people or how come a certain type of black person keeps doing things that reinforce stereotypes within reality that seems to hold them back? And I can't help but to think like, so are we just agreeing that the force that's still holding them back isn't the problem? I'm not saying that like we should negate the concept of individual responsibility. It's just that individual responsibility is a delirium. It's essentially a illusion created to serve as an apparatus of control, depending on the scope you look at the problem from. So I don't think that we should just stop at the act of having goals for the way we want people to behave within the world, because we will never get anywhere, because you're going to always be looking at the context you exist in and say, something's not right, but I can't change it because there are obviously things that will go against any action I could possibly do. And that's what causes people to build apathy towards the world because they feel like they can't change anything. And one of my biggest pet peeves about thinkers or philosophers or about people that become very philosophically political, right? And they develop like this morality burden is the idea of force itself. It's like at the end of the day, it always feels like we're at war. Quite literally, it feels like I'm always at war with something, either in my mind or on the outside with society. Because like I said before, if you look at the capital realism picture, you could picture the body, right, with the mind on top of it being an abstraction. And then on top of that mind, you have the social, and then on top of that you have ideologies that shape the social, and then on top of ideologies you have the world that exists within the background. All of this ties together, and like I said, this type of way of looking at the world is a great start, but I still think people need force. I still think people need to do something about their circumstances, or nothing will ever materially change. Ideology is great, but usually the ideologies that exist within the world exist to serve elite interests, right? On both sides. It's not just about the left or right. Maybe Marx had a good point when he was like, it's about the poor or the rich. But what I really think it's about is those with access and those with no access. And also I think it's about the people that decide what thing the access grants or rejects is important. Because when you really think about it, why do we do all of this? Because somebody else told us that this thing is important. And if you don't like the world that is fabricated from that notion, you essentially have to just like go about your day and be sad for the rest of your life, live a lie, which is worse than the first one. 3, live alone because nobody wants to participate in a world that is obviously morbid and just the way it is without there being some type of story behind it that obviously has to end happily, right? And 4th, well, I mean, I lost my train of thought, honestly.